today's review where we'll be taking a look at several different obscure Sonic games. These include Sonic Racer, Sega Sonic Bros, Sonic Edusoft, and Waku Sonic Patrol Car. While from the outset it might seem like all these games cannot be anything better than mediocre, you would be surprised. Granted, the former sentiment holds true for some of them. We might as well start off with the bad first this time around, since the Sonic franchise seems to have preset expectations lean that way anyways these days. But luckily it will leave us on a good note at the end. Alright, so kicking things off, we have one of the first two puzzle games, Sonic Racer. This game is just flat out terrible. Not Sonic 2006 or Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric terrible, but like, at least Sonic Blast aka G-Sonic levels are terrible, and it's time to cover why. Firstly, this game has no plot, no context, no world building, nothing. Like, nothing. I mean, it doesn't even provide the bare minimum that Tetris does with the naming of blocks or offering different event endings based on how well you play. Well, in more of the well-known versions, I'm not talking about those old janky dollar store handhelds or off-brand flash games. All you get is the absence of anything. This is incredibly unfortunate considering the fact that Sonic Racer, based on the way that the game was initially presented, would lend itself well to having some kind of simple plot told through the pages of a book. You know, the one we literally see on the title screen. It could have literally been anything, but instead all we get are a few pages in a book of extremely basic instructions that also doubles as a menu interface. Now, speaking of instructions while we're here and at it, they aren't particularly bad, rather they're just short and straight to the point. Not much is offered really in the way of strategy, but at least the player sort of knows what they're getting themselves into, so I'd say they do the job at the end of the day. Since any mention of the plot, or what could have been for world building in this game is connected to other parts of the game, we'll go on ahead and just pivot to the next section of this title. So let's talk about the interface. It's easy to navigate, but it severely lacks personality. I was fine with the storybook from the instructions, but then I found that the storybook is used for both instructions and the main menu. I figured it would have been a better idea to have the instructions be contained to the book as a side thing or menu option rather than end up being the menu itself, but you know, it is what it is. The reason why I point this out here is because I believe the menu could have looked much better taking on the theme of the core of the game itself, which we'll touch on here in a second. Now, apology for the tangent, but I do want to make note of the fact that this game was made for the Sega Mega Net in 1991 and is only about 256 kilobytes in size. For comparison, Sonic 1 for the Mega Drive is about 512 kilobytes. This game could literally be downloaded from the servers in a minute back in the day, so I understand why corners were cut because it's such a small game. This probably wasn't intended to be a full-fledged game anyways. It was basically digital download shovelware of the early 90s. Of course that won't stop me from criticizing it, but hopefully it brings some more understanding to why this game turned out the way that it did. Also, for future reference, the other puzzle game we'll be covering, Sega Sonic Bros, is triple the size of Sonic Racer but still fits under the 1 MB mark, meaning players could still get a better puzzle game downloaded in the same 1 minute time frame, since the idea was for people to have around a 1 megabyte per minute download speed in the early 90s. Granted, this might have been more on the privileged side of things, considering the fact that for some people, having the blessing of even getting above 20 kilobytes per second was seen as a gift from heaven. Tech talk aside, Sonic Racer could have definitely been a much better game, even if it was just double the size. Since we covered the plot that doesn't exist and talked about how bare bones the interface is, let's get into the actual visuals and gameplay. The visuals are lacking terribly. As if the title screen didn't already warn you. For the main game, you just have these two Sonic sprites that sit in the middle, occasionally attacking one another with very sluggish animations. There are only a few motions that Sonic ever acts out, which include standing, attacking, being attacked, or standing dizzy. But how about the blocks themselves that you're stacking up? They look incredibly generic, more or less, just basic shapes with one resembling the D-pad of a game controller. I mean, at least that one has something going for it unlike the others. But overall, the lack of detail on the sprites just does not help whatsoever, and if anyone says that the sprites cannot look any better because the game was made for the Sega Mega Drive, they brazenly have zero idea what they're talking about. Columns is evidence enough that the blocks could have been given a significant amount of greater detail to look more attractive. Whether the blocks are generic shapes or not aren't even really a concern when you consider the fact that Tetris is just squares glued together. So clearly basic shapes can work fine if either 1, they are appealing enough to look at thanks to impressions, shading techniques, etc., or 2, the gameplay is just so good that no one cares what the blocks look like. The frame of the game screen itself is not all that bad, and the background with the grid spaces is a bit unique with its pseudo 3D shading effect. The time and the game mode are clearly displayed as well. But while the stuff is decent, it's in no way really great. It's the expected bare minimum of any product where you have user interaction. The bigger problem is that the game suffers from extremely generic theming that contributes to its lifelessness, and the lack of coherence between aesthetics is absolutely jarring in so many ways. You start out with this title screen that has like medieval text and a storybook, and then suddenly you're thrown into some early 90s CGI cybercomputer arena. Simply put, the illustrative goals just do not calculate whatsoever. Hell, even if they wanted to go for something kind of out there and wacky like a sci-fi Middle Ages thing, I would have been 100% on board, being an artist and all. But there was zero commitment anywhere in the mix, so I can only guess that the people who were working on the title screen, menu, and instruction pages were a completely different building from the people who were putting together the actual core of the game itself. Either that, shit just got outsourced last minute, or they started with one art direction and switched things up halfway through development on a dime. There's not even a proper segue in between, you just go straight from a dusty old storybook to some weird futuristic cyber prison cell. But art direction and nightmares aside, what about the gameplay? Surely that has to be decent, right? Nope. Not really. It's not the worst thing known to mankind, of course, but to put it bluntly, it's just a crappier version of Puyo Puyo. You're literally better off just playing Panel Upon, Puzzle League for folks in the West, Tetris, or Puyo Puyo than playing this game. This game has you match up pairs of shapes to eliminate blocks, and you try to match up as many pairs as possible while not filling your board to the top. Chaining clears will give you the benefit of attacking your opponent, which will garble their blocks and match their inputs to your inputs. Could be wrong on this one, but it's something like that. Blocks can't be rotated, but instead the pieces are swapped through positions in a set arrangement, and can get woefully confusing at times, but I don't think it's something that can't be figured out with enough time playing. And since that about sums up the gameplay, what about the music? Well, I think I'll just let the game speak for itself. Yeah, I'm not sure who made a contest for make a song that sounds worse than Sonic Spinball's option menu theme, but clearly someone willingly participated with glee. Needless to say, it's no surprise that this game was cut from being included in the Sonic Gems collection. Can't really say it's much of a gem or even a diamond in the rough for that matter. But perhaps it's time to stop flipping pages and evaporating shapes. Let's move on to the other games. Next up, we have Sega Sonic Bros, a puzzle game that's actually somewhat good. Dare I say, great. Everything that Sonic Eraser did wrong, this one manages to properly get right. Why this game never got a release, but something like Sonic Eraser did, beats me, to be honest. First up, let's talk about the visuals and the theming of the game. There's actual context this time around. No more blank cover journals from Walmart or staring into the black void with graph paper lines. Instead, you get to see Sonic's world. Familiar sights from Sonic 1 for the Mega Drive make their appearance, and Sonic is accompanied by some long-lost relatives of his that apparently don't exist outside of this installment. Also, they look like Sonic OC recolors, which I find comical, but one can only assume these were precursors to Mighty and Ray. Plus, it wouldn't be much of a reach to realize that there are more hedgehogs that would look like Sonic if they're all coming from the same exact species of the same genus. I mean, just take a look at classic Amy Rose, for example. However, science class in the days of Demon Art aside, this game feels way more grounded in Sonic's realm than Sonic Eraser could ever hope to be. The game has a decent interface, excluding the arcade carryovers that are pretty self-evident on the options and mode selection screens. Its graphics definitely align with those of other Sonic arcade titles such as Sega Sonic Popcorn Shop, Waku Sonic Patrol Car, and Sega Sonic Cosmo Fighter. The patterns and colors that are familiar to the franchise are present for the job, and the game screen design itself is pretty solid. The theming makes sense with the boards being some sort of technological contraption put together by Eggman. Nothing feels out of place, cluttered, or eerie. The game ultimately feels complete, especially when factoring in its unique gameplay style and arguably soothing background music. The gameplay of Sega Sonic Bros is quite a bit different from titles such as Tetris or Puyo Puyo. Instead of just trying to match up similar pieces together or lock a line in full, you have the goal of creating connecting rings around groups of blocks or, well, hedgehogs or maybe hedge blocks that will eliminate all pieces within the capture zone. This can lead to some really sweet combo setups, some of which might be fully unexpected depending on how bad your foresight is. But if you are good at playing it ahead, you can definitely plan out some nice chains that will rack up your score. For every 10 levels, you'll be granted a Chaos Emerald that has the ability to reset the entire board if you can drop it to the bottommost level. If not, it simply clears everything above the line that lands on. Either way, it's a good way to reward the player and reset their space to prepare for the next phase. The hedge blocks can be rotated a number of times, both while falling and right before placing. This allows the player to actually cycle through different positions to check for a potential match before the block becomes dead, so to speak. This can really save the player in a bad situation where blocks begin falling too fast or they're close to filling up their entire board. While the checking mechanic sounds like it may make the game quote-unquote too easy, as some overzealous hardcore gamers would shout, it actually doesn't, since you only have a few frames of grace to check for potential correct placement before the block becomes immovable anyways. A bit off topic, but I also want to note that when you clear areas on your board, Eggman gets attacked in a pretty funny way. I definitely would say this game is leagues better than Sonic Eraser, and on its own stands as a pretty enjoyable puzzle game. Good sound effects, graphics that are based on Sonic's world, intriguing gameplay that doesn't feel like a janky clone of another puzzle game, and a lot of arcade charm packed in. So with that out of the way, what's next on the list? Education. Yeah, you heard that right. Grab your backpack, kids. We're going back to school with Sonic's Edusoft. Okay, now before you click on this video, just bear with me. This game isn't as bad as it sounds. I know educational games get a pretty bad rap, and for good reason, but I think this game has some real achievements of its own. This was an unreleased game for the Sega Master System, an 8-bit console that had Sonic games that typically looked like this. Not bad by any means, but nothing that seemed comparable to the graphics of the Sega Mega Drive. However, Sonic's Edusoft managed to get Sonic looking the exact same way as he looks on the Mega Drive, albeit with a few less colors. I think this combined with the overall graphics of the game is quite a feat in of itself. The game looks pretty vibrant and relatively detailed for a Sega Master System game. The music isn't terribly obnoxious and some of the tunes sound quite fitting in fact. The learning games do their job despite being a mixed bag at times, most notably the spelling games where some of the words seem a little bit too advanced for a child, like what kid would know what a visa is? Or they had multiple correct answers but only one answer was ever allowed. On the other hand, all the math games were fine. I mean, how would they even screw them up? The only real downside is that the inputs on the answer selection boards can feel pretty janky at times with some input lag and directional input issues. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid experience. The player walks around a world map based on the Green Hill Zone, traveling to different locations where they either visit faraway lands on a cruise, run on a field track outside of a city, go on a tropical adventure, or even attend Thanksgiving dinner? Needless to say, there is a diversity in the locations. However, I do think this could be construed as the weak point of the game. It would have probably been better if the tropics were Green Hill Zone, the city was Spring Yard Zone, the cruise took Sonic to the ancient sites of Marble Zone, etc. But perhaps a voyage abroad to real-world architectural symbols or a short walk to the Thanksgiving dinner table was all in the name of staying educational. You can also jump on trampolines, unlock gates to see more of the map, and fly around in helicopters, so it has a bit going on. Trying to figure out which route led to what area of the map felt fun in an exploratory way. The game also has a pretty comprehensive options menu, though I would argue it's kind of hard to visually decipher at first. Other than that, that's about all there is really discussed concerning Sonic's academic adventures. Time to roll on over to the next title, Waku Waku Sonic Patrol Car. This game is as basic as it is charming. It's a very simple and straightforward arcade attraction that has the player hop in the car along with Sonic as he goes on his daily patrol to keep the streets safe from Eggman's nefarious activities. Of course, one could debate whether this game is propaganda or whatever, but we're here to talk about the gameplay for the time being. The game opens up with a lively title screen that sees Sonic address a player and drive around a sign that burrows up from the ground. If you wait on the title screen long enough, it will eventually show you the nemesis you're after, the evil doctor himself. The game starts off with Sonic introducing himself to the player and hopping his patrol car heading off onto the main road. There's a brief period of play where you can get used to the controls while trying to manage traffic or waiting for your animal friends to cross the road of whom Sonic mentions by name when he sees them. After a while driving on the streets, you come across Dr. Eggman in his tank-like vehicle as he smashes into a driver, knocking them off the road and totaling their car. Unbelievable! This injustice must be rectified. So, you use your turbo boost and famous jumping abilities to put a few hits on Eggman's vehicle to send him packing. No arrest is made, so I guess he gets to get away with attempted vehicular homicide and property damage for the time being. Sonic then pulls back into the station and thanks the player for their efforts. The game then ends, giving the player a rank out of 5 stars depending on how well they drove and how fast they beat Dr. Eggman. This is pretty much where the gameplay ends. As for the graphics, well, they're quite lovely. They fit right at home with Sonic. The sidewalks are painted with the checkered pattern of Green Hill Zone's dirt, palm trees adorn the sides of the streets, the illustration of the city has nice cartoon aesthetic, and everything blends together really well. I could easily see this being the city that exists in the background of Spring Yard Zone or Starlight Zone. Who knows, maybe this is even Station Square. The music is also pretty good with some relaxing, upbeat renditions of Green Hill Zone's theme from Sonic 1. The animations of the characters are expressive and the ride is short but sweet. So with all the games covered, let's conclude this review with a ranking of the games based on their attributes and which ones I would recommend you to play. Coming in at first place is Sega Sonic Bros. This is easily the best game in this entire list. It is a challenging, fast-paced, and fun puzzle game that I think deserves to get an official release. It has a lot of untapped potential and what it has going for it already is pretty promising. Following it would be Waku Waku Sonic Patrol Car and Sonic's Edusoft. If you're curious to get your hands on some obscure games that can offer a charming experience or a decent time, these would be your second and third place picks. Lastly, and most certainly least, is Sonic Eraser. Just don't even consider that this game exists, literally erase it from your memory, no pun intended, and go play Sega Sonic Bros or any decent puzzle game instead. Anyways, with the games ranked, that will be the end of this review session. I hope you all enjoyed this critique and stick around for more content in the future. See you in the next one.